Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Erstanden ist der heilige Christ, which translates to Christ our Lord is risen today. All in all, fairly straightforward chorale. A couple of interesting points here and there like we would expect in most of the chorales, so we're just going to hop right into the analysis. One flat in the key signature. We start on F, we end on F. I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is F major. After our tonic triad, we have F, A, C, and F. No need to reanalyze, that's another F major chord. Neighbor tone here in the tenor before we get F, A, D, and F. We get this brief D minor triad here, which is interesting because it's a motive that we're going to see throughout the chorale. And then we get four voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm, and typically this is indicative of the fact that we have a chord happening here, and there's definitely a chord being implied, but if you take a look at the tones that are being voiced here, E, G, E, and G, we have an incomplete triad, but E and G is particularly interesting because that's the root and the third of the 7 chord of the chorale, or of the key rather. And with 7, the 5th of the chord is really important because the quality of the triad diatonically is diminished, and diminished comes from that 5th, in this case E to B flat. So I guess that's what's being implied here. We're not seeing the 5th fully present, even though it's being implied. Maybe because it's happening off the harmonic rhythm, we should take it with a grain of salt. But I think also what you could potentially infer from this is that maybe a passing 5-6 chord is happening. 7 and 5-6 are basically the same chord, both in terms of pitch and function, so it's fairly negligible. But all in all, there's definitely some type of passing dominant chord here because of the presence of the leading tone in 2 of the voices. It's also very interesting that Bach chose to double the leading tone here, potentially speaking, instead of incorporating the 5th in one of the voices. It's pretty fascinating. But whatever this dominant chord or dominant, implied dominant functioning chord is, following it is another 6 chord, D, F, F, and A. So we kind of have like a 6-6 going to 6 in root position progression. We typically would expect it to be bridged by a chord in first inversion that is a step below, so like 5-6. So maybe that's an argument for this being a 5-6 chord, like a rootless triad. And it also makes a lot of sense because if we're doubling the leading tone, typically we're not going to see that in a diminished triad, so maybe 5-6 is actually the chord here rather than 7. Who knows? At the end of the day, they both function the same way anyways, so it's not too big of a deal to have to focus on. We have a passing tone in the melody as well. We then have C, G, F, and C. This F is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. We know that C major is being implied, which is our 5 chord, and also sort of foreshadowing the mid-phrase modulation we're going to get to the key of C major. We have another C major chord on the downbeat, on beat 2, the next numbered beat, before we get some passing tones in the bass and the alto. E, C, G, and G spells C major over E, so we'll just change the figured bass. The C is a chord tone, so we don't need to reanalyze it. And then we get F, C, G, and A, which we know is implying a tonic triad, but the 9/8 suspension over the bass and this little enclosure here are both non-chord tones. And I'm going to say that this is where the chorale modulates to the key of C major. Whether it happens on beat 2 or on beat 1, I feel like this is a fairly nebulous or not really relevant thing to have to distinguish. I'm just going to say it happens on beat 1 because that's where F happens, or at least F is first referenced in this 2-beat figure if we're just looking at these 2 beats here, and 1 turns into 4 because F is also the subdominant in the key of C. This E is like a passing 7th, a little delayed passing 7th, and then we get D, D, F, and B natural, which is B diminished in first inversion, that's a 7-6, and then our perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major concludes with C major, C, G, F, and C. But this F is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and we know that this is our tonic after the F resolves down to E. Next phrase, we do move back to the key of F major, but again we get another mid-phrase modulation where we end with a half cadence in a different key, or I guess we didn't end the first phrase with a half cadence, but we're ending in a different key that we start with, so 2 mid-phrase modulations in this chorale. And we're going to be moving to the key of D minor. So I think this C here is our 5 chord now in the key of F. And the reason why I'm analyzing over this C chord rather than the C7 chord on the next beat is that by the time we hear the B flat, I feel like we're already in the key of F. That's just how I hear it from an analytical standpoint. You could say that we've modulated to the key of F after this point as well. There are many takes that you can have about this particular modulation, but E, C, G, and B flat is C7 over E, which would be just taking our F chord, same Roman numeral, and changing the figure base to reflect first inversion and that added 7th, and that resolves to F, F, C, G, and A, another suspension, but still an implied tonic. This A is a chord tone, and again we're going to see this motif here, where by the time we get the resolution, we have D introduced in another voice, which turns our 1 chord into 6/6. So that's kind of the hallmark, or like the maker's mark of this chorale. Passing tone in the bass and the little neighbor tone here in the melody before we get D, D, F, and A, which is just taking our 6th chord and putting it in root position. Not too much to write home about there, except for we're missing the passing chord here in its entirety. We see that the E and the G are still referenced, but the inner voices stay static. This B flat's also a passing tone. We then get E, C, G, and C. That's our 5 chord in first inversion, so 5, 6. And then we have a passing tone in the tenor and a neighbor tone in the alto before we get E, E, G, and C again. No need to reanalyze. And then we get our first little bout of secondary dominance in this chorale, and this is going to be our gateway into the key of D minor. At least this is the way that I have it analyzed. This F sharp is a secondary passing tone, and this A is also a non-chord tone. We have F sharp, E, A, and C, which spells F sharp minor 7 flat 5. So 7 half diminished of 2, because G is our 2 in the key of F major, and F sharp is its leading tone, so this is a 7 of 2 chord. And that takes us to exactly where we would expect: G minor, G, D, G, and B flat. Of course, we have this A here, and that's a 9/8 suspension over the bass, but still 2 chords being implied, and this also turns into 4 in the key of D minor. And that's where we resolve actually to D minor afterwards: D, D, A, and in typical Bach fashion we get this suspension over the D minor chord. Usually it's a 9/8 suspension. I think we even get one later as well, but suspending over this D minor chord is a very typical thing Bach does across his chorales, where we see D minor in the texture, especially when it's like here metrically as well. It's something that I'm just realizing. But this G is a 4/3 suspension, this F and this F are both chord tones, and this E is a lower neighbor, very brief non-chord tone there as well. D, A, F, and A, that's another D minor chord. Sorry, this is our tonic. It's another D minor chord, so we don't need to reanalyze it. We have this delayed passing 7th in the bass as well, before we get B flat, D, F, and G. That's G minor 7 over B flat, which is 4, 6, 5. I think you could also make the argument that if this F is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, this E could be our root, even though I think it's unlikely in this case, but maybe you could analyze this as 2/4/3 as well. I don't think that that's the case, because this is a Phrygian half cadence, and if you know anything about Bach's Phrygian half cadences, it's that typically speaking we expect to see a 4/6 chord go to a 5 chord, and that's based off of empirical evidence. It's that if we don't see a clear no modifications necessary 4/6 chord, we'll either see just a plain 4/6 chord, or in this case a 4/6/5 chord as the predominant chord, or we'll see a 2/4/3 chord that could also be interpreted as a 4/6 chord. So it's always partially a 4/6 chord. And then we go to 5, A, E, C sharp, and A, which is our dominant. That's what makes this the Phrygian half cadence, is the flat 6 to 5 half step motion between the bass notes in the cadence. But moving ahead, we actually get a very interesting cadence. We get a deceptive cadence, definitely the least common cadential type in the chorales, that's for sure. But pretty much immediately after our resolution to our half cadence here, D, F, D, and A, which is our tonic in the key of D minor, we're going to move directly back to the key of F major. I said that this is our 6th chord. I think there are other ways that you could analyze this as well. I think it's unlikely that we get a minor dominant on the next beat, though. I feel like by the time we see the C natural, we are in the key of F major, but there are lots of different ways to interpret this particular chorale, or really any of the chorales in general. I just feel like this is my logical take. So here it feels like D minor is really the only place we can modulate. I suppose A major could be a place as well, but it would be a little bit harder to argue. But after D minor, we get a bit of transitive harmony instead of going to F major like we would expect based on seeing some of the voices, the A's and the C's especially. We get E natural here in the alto. We have an A minor chord, A, E, and C, which is our 3 chord. We would expect 6 to go to 2, but here we see 6 going to 3, and that's what I mean by transitive harmony, that it's going the opposite way. Typically 3 wants to go to 6. Here we're seeing 6 go to 3. After our 3 chord, we get A, C, E, and C again. We don't need to reanalyze, and we have some passing tones in the alto and the bass as well. And then here's an interesting progression, 3 going to 5, F, C, G, and D. However, I think, or not D, sorry, B flat. This F is most likely an accented non-chord tone, and what we're really looking at is E, C, G, and B flat, which is 5, 6, 5, and 3 going to 5. It's not the most uncommon chord progression, but it's definitely not the most common. It's definitely right in the middle, sort of a middle or middle lower tier progression in terms of frequency, but it's definitely interesting when you see it because 3 and 5 share 2 notes in common just due to that nature of them having a root that's a third apart from one another. So the progression isn't very common, but we've even seen cadences where 3 is our predominant chord, so it can happen. But after our 5, 6, 5 chord, we resolve where we would expect to our 1, F, C, G, and A. Of course, we get that 9/8 suspension that sort of blurries the resolution a bit. And then in typical Bach fashion, we have 2 chord tones here as well, so we don't need to mark them. But again, this motivic chord progression where we see 1 get faked out by the time we get the resolution, we get a D. In this case, it's in the tenor. It might actually be in the tenor in the rest of the cases too, but that's not as important. We have F, D, F, and A, which takes our 1 chord and turns it into a 6/6 chord. And we have some passing tones in the lower voices as well. We then have D, B flat, E, and G. Sorry, this D is an accented non-chord tone, and we get C sharp, B flat, E, and G, which is a fully diminished 7th chord, and it would be the leading tone chord to D, which is our 6, so 7, 7 of 6, and that's exactly where we go. And here's where we see that 9/8 suspension in the D minor chord here, so D, A, E, and F. This E is like I just mentioned, 9/8 suspension. It is implying our 6th chord though, but of course in typical Bach fashion, by the time we get the resolution, the chord changes. This F is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We get B flat, D, and F, which is our 4 chord. 6 going to 4, not the most common progression as well. This A is also a non-chord tone. It's a passing 7th. We then get C natural, G, C, and E, which is our 5 chord, C major, passing 7th in the alto, and then we cadence on D minor. So kind of harkening back to the first, I feel like we saw this progression earlier. I might be crazy, but we've even in the F major sections, we've been getting a lot of allusions to D minor. So this feels sort of like a kind of like a poetic gesture to bringing that idea to an end, because we're not going to be seeing 6 for the rest of the chorale. But moving forward, we're still going to stay in the key of F major. We end in a perfect authentic cadence, and yeah, no more modulations for the rest of the chorale. D, A, D, and F is another D minor chord. We don't need to reanalyze. Passing 7th in the bass. B flat, G, D, and G is G minor over B flat, so 6 going to 2. Fairly normative chord progression there. This F is a neighbor tone, and then we have B flat, C, E, and G, which is C7 over B flat. That's a 5/4/2 chord, and we know where we would expect this to resolve, to a tonic triad in first inversion, and that's exactly where it goes. A, C, F, and A. 1/6. 4/2 chords typically resolve that way, the root down a 5th and the bass down by step, so we're going to typically go down to a chord that is a fifth below in first inversion. This is just one case where we would see a 4-2 chord resolve properly. We then have G, D, D, and B flat, which is a 2 chord, G minor. Actually, almost got tricked up there. You might be tempted to call this a 2 chord, but I think actually this E is our chord tone, and this is most likely a 7-6 chord. And when we see a 1-6 going to a 7-6 chord, chances are you know it's going to be on the other side, a root position tonic triad, F, A, F, and A. It's interesting to see it resolve in this particular fashion, but we do see it resolving this way, and this is a very common chord progression in Bach, which makes me feel like this is operating like a 7-6 chord rather than a 2 chord, or maybe 2 going to 7, or maybe this is a 2 chord. It's entirely up to you the way that you want to analyze. There are lots of different viewpoints one could take about this particular chord. It just feels more like a 7-6 chord to me based on my previous experience with Bach. But after these passing tones in the lower voices, we have A, C, F, and A, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. Passing tone in the bass again before we get C, C, E, and G. It's our 5 chord, C major. A little delayed passing 7th as well before we get D, A, E, and F. Another one of these 9/8 suspensions over a D minor chord. This is a 6 chord in the key of F major. And then we get a passing tone in the bass, more specifically a passing 7th, B flat, D, and F. Another one of these 6-4 progressions. We saw this before in the previous phrase. It's almost like we're getting the resolution to the progression the way that we would have expected it previously, but instead of getting an F major chord, we got a D minor chord. And now we're actually getting the resolution that we would have expected. So after our 4 chord, passing 7th in the tenor, C, G, C, and E is our 5 chord, C major. This B flat is a chordal 7th, but it's a non-chord tone in this context. And then we get F major, F, A, C, and F, which is our tonic triad in root position. That's pretty much going to wrap up today's chorale. All in all, fairly straightforward. Not too much to write home about. I would say really the only interesting thing to take note of from a progressional standpoint is what's going on here with the potentially rootless triad and the fact that we get a couple of mid-phrase modulations, which are always things that I'm keeping track of in the chorales when I'm identifying them. But other than that, fairly straightforward. And that's going to be the end of the video. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. And I hope you take care.